Today I'm super excited because we're going to be analysing one of my favourite poems from one of my favourite poets. It's My Last Duchess by Robert Browning. Now, if you're doing GCSE English in England, you're probably studying My Last Duchess as one of the poems in the Power and Conflict section of the exam, or maybe you're studying it as part of your university course if you're doing English in university. I know that I studied Browning as part of the Victorian module in my first year at Oxford, and I tell you, I really liked him. There's a lot of good writers in the Victorian module, but I don't think there's a ton of great poets. I guess Thomas Hardy might fit in there. A lot of people would say Tennyson, but to be honest, Tennyson I thought was a bit of a crusty old bastard even back when he was writing. The funny thing about Browning is, I'm not sure how appreciated he would have been in his time, even though he stood out head and shoulders from all the other poets writing. My Last Duchess is part of a collection of poetry called Dramatic Lyrics. It's a great volume. I highly recommend you pick it up if you do like Browning, because there's some other great poems in there as well, like the famous Porphyria's Lover, and if you like My Last Duchess, you'll love Porphyria's Lover. But the thing is, around 1842, I think the general public, or people who would have been reading poetry, they would have been still reading the Romantics. They would have been reading Wordsworth, they would have been reading Shelley, Blake, Byron and all that. So it was hard going back in Victorian times for a writer, especially someone who was so ahead of the curve like Browning. And why was he ahead of the curve? Because he was writing stuff that just hadn't really been written before, or the form of poetry hadn't been used as a vehicle for this kind of expression. We're talking dramatic monologues, we're talking psychological case studies that put you in the mind or in front of the person who is having a bit of a mental breakdown, or has had a mental breakdown before, or has done something heinous and violent and deplorable. And that's what My Last Duchess does perfectly. It is one of the best dramatic monologues you can read that exemplifies the degradation of the character. It's fascinating. Now, you might not like My Last Duchess. I know a lot of people don't, and they think, oh, it's too long and it's a bit boring and yama yama yama, he just goes on and on and on. But really, if you read it with a little bit of attention to detail and consider it like a story where it's about this duke who is the Duke of Ferrara, okay? And the reason Browning, uses an Italian duke, and he puts a lot of his poems are set in Italy, is because he lived there a huge majority of his life. He was in love with the country, knew a lot about it. But just put yourself in the scene. There is this duke, and he is showing an emissary around his, let's say, palace or whatever. And he's showing him around in preparation for his second wife. He's going to marry somebody else. And he's taking this guy on a walking tour through probably his gallery, or part of the palace that has a lot of paintings. He's giving him a little tour. And as he's giving a tour, he's musing on his previous wife. Okay, so he's getting ready to marry somebody else, and he's stopped in front of a painting. And I think it's a big painting of his previous wife, who we learn is no longer with us, who we learn is dead, and who it's fairly certain that he killed her. And this gets revealed over the course of the poem, and that's why it's such a tense poem, and you just see in this mental breakdown as he reveals that he had his previous wife killed. Okay, so what we're going to do, I haven't read this poem in a long time. I did love it back in university, but that was a million years ago. What we'll do now is I'm going to read through it, giving some of the inflections that I think would make the poem more understandable. Like if you just read a poem, just straight, in your mind, not reading it out loud, not giving it any characterization or anything, then of course you're not going to really understand what's going on. Poems are supposed to be read out loud, especially dramatic monologues like this one from Browning. So I'm going to give it a quick read as a refresher, and then what I'll do is I'm just going to go off and analyze it. We'll go line by line, or we'll go through and I'll analyze what appeals to me, what jumps out at me. You can then use some of these ideas in your exam if you're studying an exam. But what I would implore you, this is your task during this video, is when I say something, when I pick out something, maybe I choose a word and I go, well, this symbolizes this or this or this. What I want you to do is try and disagree with me. I am probably right on a lot of things I'm saying. I don't want to be big-headed, I'm just saying. You will come up with your own insights, your own unique take on the poem, And not only that, but you might just more easily remember my points if you come at a position like, is that true? And try and come up with your own sort of spin on things, okay? You might ultimately agree, but be a bit skeptical. Be like, does that really symbolize or say that? Okay? And then you'll have your own insights and you'll be able to write about My Last Duchess by Robert Browning confidently. If you've already read it a billion times, you don't want to listen to me reading it again, then skip on the video. It's only going to take me a minute or so to read through, and you can get into the analysis. Or listen to me and we'll jump right in together. That's my last Duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. I call that piece a wonder now. Frau Pandolf's hands worked busily a day, and there she stands. Wilt please you sit and look at her? I said Frau Pandolf by design, for never read strangers like you that pictured countenance, the depth and passion of its earnest glance. But to myself they turned, since none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you but I, and seemed as they would ask me, if they durst, how such a glance came there. So, not the first are you to turn and ask thus. Sir, 'twas not her husband's presence only called that spot of joy into the Duchess's cheek. Perhaps Frau Pandolf chanced to say, her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much, or paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half flush that dies along her throat. Such stuff was courtesy, she thought, and cause enough for calling up that spot of joy. She had a heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad, too easily impressed. She liked what era she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. So it was all one, my favour at her breast, the dropping of the daylight in the west, the bough of cherries some officious fool broke in the orchard for her, the white mule she rode with round the terrace. All and each would draw from her alike the approving speech, or blush at least. She thanked men, good, but thanked somehow, I know not how, as if she ranked my gift of a 900 years old name with anybody's gift. Who'd stoop to blame this sort of trifling? Even had you skill in speech, which I have not, to make your will quite clear to such an one and say, just this or that in you disgusts me, here you miss or there exceed the mark, and if she let herself be lessoned so, nor plainly set her wits to yours forsooth, and made excuse, even then would be some stooping, and I choose never to stoop. Oh, sir, she smiled, no doubt, whene'er I passed her, but who passed without much the same smile? This grew. I gave commands. Then all smiles stopped together. There she stands, as if alive. Will't please you rise? We'll meet the company below then. I repeat, the Count, your master's known munificence, is ample warrant that no just pretence of mine for dowry will be disallowed. Though his fair daughter's self, as I avowed at starting, is my object. Nay, we'll go down together, sir. Oh, notice Neptune, though, taming a seahorse. Thought a rarity, which Claus of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me. Right, let's start by talking about the poetic structure, the poetic form of My Last Duchess. We'll get that out of the way so then we can start deep diving into the substance. Now, the first thing you need to know is that this poem is written in what's called heroic verse. What's heroic verse? Heroic verse is a form of poetry that is very well suited to epics. All right, think long, long tales of woe and adventure and tragedy and fighting. And obviously, it's quite well suited to dramatic monologues as well, because it gives you a lot of freedom, a lot of space to play with. What does a heroic verse look like? Basically, it's made up of rhyming couplets. So A, B, B, C, C, D, D, and so on. You can see, that's My Last Duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. I call, A, that piece a wonder now, Frau Pandolf's hands worked busily a day, and there she stands, B, B. So the ends of the lines both rhyme. Now, you'd be forgiven for not actually noticing that, because Browning is a master here at disguising the fact that it's a poem at all. The fact that it rhymes is amazing because how he's put the pauses, like where he puts the full stops, where he puts the run-on lines, like when a line doesn't end, full stop at the end, but keeps going on to the next one, that's called enjambment. Where he puts the pauses, or caesura, because a pause in a poem is called a caesura, is quite expertly crafted, so it sounds like a conversation. So this monologue, it sounds conversational. It sounds like somebody's actually talking to you. It doesn't really sound like a poem. You know what I mean? So that's one part of the genius, is the fact that that's quite well hidden. And so that's why you need to read it out loud. And with poems, you don't just stop and pause at the end of the line regardless, because you're going to ruin some of the meaning. Yeah, that might fit the rhyme, but you won't get the conversational structure, and that's not how it's meant to be read anyway. Now, with heroic verse, another thing, in addition to the rhyming couplets, is the fact that it's written in iambic pentameter. What's iambic pentameter? So what's iambic pentameter? Let's just take a random line. Okay, let's say, the depth and passion of its earnest glance. So in this line, it's going to have 5 stresses. That's what pentameter means. Pent means 5 and in the meter, 5 in the meter. The depth and passion of its earnest glance. Okay, it doesn't fit exactly, and we can get really deep in the weeds about where the stresses actually lie and what the different stresses are called. For example, the depth is stressed, and that part of the syllable of passion is stressed. Passion of isn't really a stressed word. It's, something we glide over, but we're not going to get confusing here and talk about what that actually is. It's an unstressed foot. Okay, we might call it like a pyrrhic foot. Unless you want to get really geeky, you don't need to know that right now. It's earnest glance. Okay, so roughly 5, and an iamb is 2 beats, or one that goes from unstressed to stressed. The dum, the dum. Okay, the depth and passion of its earnest glance. We don't want to get too deep into the weeds because Browning wants to make this conversational, and because he doesn't want to make it too overtly poetic, he's not going to hit the stresses exactly. I mean, you can even see at the beginning, now he actually inverts the stress. This is called a trochaic foot. A trochee is the opposite of an iamb. An iamb goes from unstress to stress in a 2-beated foot. So, but here he inverts it. So that's my. So he begins on a stress. At least I think he does. It depends on the reader. You could say that's my. All right. But then that gives it a different nuance, because it's like he's comparing it to somebody else's, like as in, oh, that's not your last Duchess, that's my last Duchess. But I think because he's giving this guy, this emissary, a walking tour of his palace, and because they've just come in front of a painting of his, last Duchess, he's saying, that's my last Duchess. So it doesn't fit exactly, but Browning is being very flexible within the scheme in order to make it seem closer to speech. This is another way that it kind of resists the poetic form, or it uses the poetic form expertly to the point where it's almost that breaking point. It sounds so conversational. You'll see as the poem goes on that Browning uses a lot of parenthesis to break up the lines. So more breaks make it, again, seem less poetic, more conversational, more like a monologue, more like somebody speaking, and it also shows a fracturing of the mind. We can jump ahead quickly, so I'll tell you what I mean. She thanked men. And then there's a pause, there's a caesura, or I would call this a parenthesis, because he's kind of breaking up the train of thought, which would have been complete otherwise. She thanked men. Good, but thanked somehow. Break. I know not how. Break. As if she ranked, and then it goes on like that. So it's he's using the form to show the mental breakdown. That's what's great about this. So you can, if you say that, if you're taking an exam and talk about how the way Browning uses the poetic form or resists the poetic form with parenthesis and enjambment, caesura and all that reflects the fractured state of the Duke's mind. Probably get top marks for something like that. Now, right from the start, we know something's up. Where is the stress in the first line? Or where is one of the stresses? Last. That's my last Duchess. And already, before we even go beyond the first line, that implies so much about what's going on. That's my last Duchess. So to me, that sounds like, well, we already know he's looking for a new one, okay? We already know that she's not around anymore for some reason. There's tension right from the start. Why is she not around? You've already got a question, and, well, which may be answered, but it's up to you over the course of the poem to answer it. That's my last Duchess. But also, I think this shows that he considers people or women or people connected to him as commodities. This guy is quite a tyrant, okay? He collects them as though they are not real people, they're just things. Oh, that's my last one, painted on the wall, all right? It kind of objectifies it. And if you think about the whole idea of painting somebody, or making something into an art, even making something into a poem or making something into a statue, that's the process of objectifying somebody. And yes, the funny thing is you can make something that's ephemeral, something that dies quickly or is short-lived, you can make that last forever essentially by immortalizing them in art. So the painting immortalizes her. Okay, she might be dead, but she's kind of around forever. She's immortalized in painting. But during the process of immortalization, something is robbed, and it's humanity. Humanity is robbed. So right from the start, we know, just from that word, last, and also maybe painted, that the Duke objectifies people, and he objectified his wife. We're going to see a lot of issues to do with control come over the course of this dramatic monologue. And so he's looking for a new Duchess, or he's looking for a new wife, and they're super replaceable, easy to replace. Oh, I didn't like that one, that's my last one, get rid of her, bring in a new one. Also, I like how we just immediately thrown into the action a little bit. Or, well, it's not really action because this is more of a monologue, so it's a train of thought that we're following, but we're thrown into a scene, a place, a time, we're thrown into somebody's skin almost. If you see, Browning uses the direct address, you. So it's almost like he's talking to us, and we, the reader, are in the footsteps of this emissary. So we've been thrown into his skin, and we're close to this Duke. And he uses a technique called in medias res, so in the middle of things, which is also a very common technique for epic poetry. Like Homer, he uses in medias res in his epics. And basically you're just thrown into the middle of things. So we are dropped into a scene. We've been walking around the palace. We've, had some chats with this Duke dude, and we've seen some other paintings and stuff like that. And now we're here in front of this painting. So some stuff's gone on before, and we're thrown into this person's skin, and we are in front of this deplorable Duke. Now the next line as well just ramps up the tension, and it puts ideas in your head. This is very subtle. It's the power of suggestion. Now, Browning's not outright saying, at least not yet, that this Duke killed his wife, but we can infer it quite quickly on. He says, that's my last Duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. As if she were alive. So he doesn't have to say she's dead, but how can someone look as if she were alive if she wasn't dead? Now, of course, he could just be talking about the painting, all right? Now, she might actually be still alive somewhere, but the painting, he's talking about that one. Well, it's such a good painting. It's such a good representation that it looks as though it's real. It's a real living person. But really, there's a double meaning going on here, and we know that the wife, or I know, or I feel like I know, that she's dead. You can't look as if you were alive if you're not alive. And if you're talking about the painting looking as if it were alive, once again, it reinforces the fact that it's fake. Now, the painting might be very, very good, and the painter, who is Fra Pandolf, he might be very, very skilled, but it's not real. You can still tell it's fake. And this is a tension that I think all artists, but particularly writers, hit time and time again. They want to make you see. And I'm reminded of a quote by Joseph Conrad, the writer of Heart of Darkness. My task, by the written word, above all, is to make you feel, to make you hear. Above all, my task is to make you see. There's always an anxiety that the words aren't good enough, or we can't find the perfect word to actually replicate experience. And you know that saying, a painting or a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, Leonardo da Vinci kind of expanded upon that when he said, your tongue will be paralyzed by thirst and your body by sleep and hunger before you can show with words what the painter shows us in an instant. Things are really removed from reality. You've got this painter trying to faithfully represent the Duchess in painting. But we're not seeing this painting, we're not actually standing in front of it, and if we can imagine a painting in front of us, then that actually speaks to Browning's mastery, because he's using words. And what he's basically saying is, I can't actually make you see this poem, can't make you see reality, I'm so removed I can only use words. But it's up to you. Is he good enough? Has he done a good job? Can you actually see? Can you imagine the characters in your mind and the painting in front of you? I can, sort of, myself. So with words, you have to be subtle. You can't be like just direct, or at least that's not as powerful, because how we imagine things in our mind is really individualistic. So for me, when I see looking as if she were alive, not only do I imagine, oh, she looks as though she were alive, I also, by virtue of the word looking, this visual language, I start imagining her eyes. You know, like there's certain paintings, like the Mona Lisa, where the eyes just follow you around the room. It's quite creepy. Now, Browning hasn't actually mentioned her eyes, at least not yet, but he does talk about her gaze going everywhere over the course of the poem, and how she used to look at different people and all that. And this was a problem for him. He gets really jealous and bad things start to happen, or a really bad thing happens. And so I'm imagining her eyes without him even saying about her eyes yet. So when you're reading a poem, always look where the pauses are. Look where the caesura are, okay? Now, look at the second line. Looking as if she were alive. Pause, caesura, full stop, after the word alive. Now, this does a couple of things. Firstly, it causes you to focus on the word where the pause has come after, and it emphasizes it. So now you're thinking alive. And if you're thinking alive, you're thinking the opposite. You're thinking she's dead, okay? But then you're also thinking about what it means to be alive. You know, like we just talked about, paintings, poetries can immortalize people forever. Does that mean they're actually alive, or are they alive in a different way? You know, there's things like this. It gets you really thinking about this nature of living and death. But also what it does as well is it doesn't let the reader run on to the end. Now, if you ran on all the way to the end, you'd get to I call, which rhymes with wall. Now, if it was just da-dum, 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 boom, 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 and a rhyme, then it would feel like a poem, because it would be wall, call, hand, stand, said, read, you know? But Browning doesn't want that. He doesn't want the rhymes to be too obvious. He doesn't want the fact that it's a poem, an artifice, something fake, to be too obvious. He's trying his best to replicate something real, replicate a conversation, replicate a monologue. It's just words on a page until we speak them, but it sounds less poetic. It's him fighting against the constraints of the language. It's him fighting against the constraints of the poetic form. Well, what else does he do, all right? I like the fact that he uses a lot of questions, some of them rhetorical and some of them not, some of them actually soliciting an answer or looking for an answer. So you can see here, will please you sit and look at her? So he's asking the emissary, or he's asking us, the reader, or asking us, the reader who is in the shoes of the emissary, to sit and look. And the funny thing is, this idea of control and power comes in again, because we don't hear the emissary's response. We're not allowed to give a response. It's just dictated for us. We powerlessly sit down. And we know that the emissary sits down in front of the painting, because later in the poem he says, "Will please you rise?" So he sat down, we know he sat down, and now he's rising. Now think about what it looks like when you lower yourself, when you sit down. It's a humbling, social, face-giving, stance, right? You bow before a king or queen. You kneel before somebody who's, socially, hierarchically higher than you. And that's what the Duke is doing. He's not allowing an actual concrete response. He's just manipulating the person. Down you go, up you go. I'm going to make you go down. I'm going to make you go up. And just, we get an insight into his character. This is the sort of person that probably had his wife murdered. And it paints a picture of the scene without having to say too much. Like, why are they sitting down? Have they been walking for a long time? Are there, and we don't know if the Duke is sitting. It feels like he's not. It feels like he's standing, giving a bit of a speech of some sort. But why are they sitting? Are they tired? Has it been a long day? Or is it out of respect? Is it out of control? Is it because the painting is so huge that you want to sit and look up at it, like in awe? Like, how big is this painting? It's not going to be, I don't imagine a small one in my mind. Or is it because it's just an opportunity for the Duke to run on and say his thing. Again, imposing his will onto reality. You listen to me now. Sit down, look at this painting, and listen. Here's another tip when you're reading a poem. Look for repetition. If something is repeated, even twice, but it's repeated more than twice, that's important. Now, the first piece of repetition that I kind of see is a name, Fra Pandolf. Fra Pandolf's hands worked busily day, and there she stands. Well, please you sit and look at her. I said Fra Pandolf by design. And then a bit later, Fra Pandolf chanced to say. So why is he repeating Fra Pandolf? I mean, you can make up your own mind about this, but really, is he showing off because Fra Pandolf is quite esteemed? He's meant to be a good artist, and he does show off again when he talks about Klaus of Innsbruck, someone else who made some other thing in his palace or wherever he is. Is he showing off? Is he saying like, I'm so, high in status, I'm so wealthy, I'm so important and respectable that I can command this amazing painter? Or is there some worry and jealousy and fear there? Now, if you look at it, every time he mentions Fra Pandolf, you get a bit more information that doesn't sit quite well. His hands, Fra Pandolf's hands, worked busily a day. Of course, you're a painter. Your hands are going to be working busily, but that's quite a sensual image, is it not? Like hands working, and his lady's sitting there while this artist's hands are moving. He just sees hands, all right? Is he jealous? I don't know. Then he mentions again, Fra Pandolf by design. And then he says, never read strangers like you that pictured countenance, the depth and passion of its earnest glance. So what's he saying? He's saying the way the lady, the Duchess, is looking, it's not a way that she would look at strangers or should. Like a lot of people are saying, you know what, it's amazing that she looks the way she does because it's so intimate. So you start thinking, was the Duke there while Fra Pandolf was painting the lady, and was she looking at the Duke, and then that called up the spot of joy in her cheek? A very intimate look, I'm assuming she has in the painting, or at least to the Duke anyway. And he's saying, no, sir, it wasn't only her husband's presence, 'twas not her husband's presence only, called that spot of joy into the Duchess's cheek. Perhaps Fra Pandolf chanced to say, her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much, or paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half flush that dies along her throat. But that calls up the spot of joy, and he's repeating again, spot of joy. And this is where you can imagine the redness, you can imagine the smile, you can imagine not only a spot of joy in the Duchess, but redness of rage and jealousy and envy in the Duke. And he's saying, she had a heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad, too easily impressed. She liked whatever she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. So this isn't exact repetition, but it is parallelism. So like the structure and of the sentences are kind of repeated. Too soon made glad, too easily impressed. This is a parallelism, too. She liked whatever she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. So he's really emphasizing this aspect. He doesn't need to say I was jealous that she was looking at other people, that I was jealous that she was happy because of someone else. It's right there, we can infer it. That's what makes Browning quite a genius, because we know it without him having to say it. Now let's look at one of my favourite lines. Paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half flush that dies along her throat. So this returns to what I was talking about earlier, the anxiety of artists. Now clearly, just like a poet, painter has the same sort of anxiety. That beautiful flush along your throat that comes and goes, paint can't reproduce that. It just can't. It's, there are certain things that art cannot capture, and they cannot capture that beautiful, special part of reality perfectly. It's this idea of implication. What are we being forced to think about without actually having to properly think about it? Like Browning's not actually saying, I strangled her, or I cut her throat, or I hung her, or anything like that. But suddenly, we see the word dies and throat. Okay, so we start thinking, well, why is she not around anymore? We got the word dies in our mind without him having to say that she was killed. We got the word throat, but in a different context. Again, this is all very subtle, but I think it's deliberate. Also look, again, where the parenthesis, where the caesura, where the break, where the fracture in the sentence comes. She had a heart. how shall I say, too soon made glad. So again, we've got to focus on heart. And now I'm thinking thighs, throat, heart. These don't feel like romantic images to me, although a heart can be. I just start thinking of her heart stopping, you know what I mean? And to be honest, if you look at the poetic form, the heart does stop. Right after the word heart, Browning stops it. How shall I say? It's like, boop, it's a moment of stopping. Heart. You're going to focus on the heart and the heart is going to stop. And not only that, you can see his descent into madness as he kind of asks himself a rhetorical question. He's trying to think, how do I phrase this in such a way that I don't seem insane or jealous? How can I put it in the best possible way? And the best possible way he could put it in is that she had a heart too soon made glad, too easily impressed. But what he's really saying is she was a bit too seductive, a bit too coquettish. She was a bit maybe flirtatious. Maybe she was a bit over-friendly with people. Maybe he really wants to call her a whore. And he goes, it's all one, it's all the same thing. Like, my favour at her breast, again, we're thinking breast, we're thinking chest, we're thinking heart, we're thinking of all these delicate areas that can stop quite easily if someone's got a bit of a power-mad mindset. And he's saying, like, my gift of a 900 years old name is ranked with anybody's. Some fool broke a bough of cherries for her in the orchard. Or she's riding a mule. And he even gets jealous of a sunset. He says the dropping of the daylight in the west, that called up the spot of joy. So all these things he's jealous of. He's not just jealous of people, he's jealous of freaking everything. He wants her to be his little object that he can make a commodity out of, that he can control completely, who only responds favourably to him. He's jealous of the freaking sunset. And then here's a little tip for life. Sometimes men who are very high in power and have a lot of money and status, they're the most insecure men of all. They're very easy to dethrone. You can disrespect them without even knowing it. And he's like, how dare this bitch rank my name? He's saying 900 years old name. I've got this title. Don't you know who I am? I'm a man to be respected. And she just smiles on me as if I'm anybody. So this is dangerous. You always want to appeal or not appear to disrespect someone like this, because bad shit's going to happen. Now, I don't know about you, but I picture this man as ranting, all right? He's held it in this far, and now there's just a complete breakdown, and he just goes off on a run. And we can see this by all the times it's fractured in the sentence. It just hits it, and he just goes, all and each would draw from her alike the approving speech, or blush at least. So everything's flowing along smoothly, and then you get more pauses, more caesura, more parenthesis in the lines. She thanked men. Good. But thanked somehow, I know not how. And he's trying to be careful, as if she ranked my gift of a 900 years old name with anybody's gift. So it goes from fracturing to smooth. You've got enjambment, it runs onto the next line, and there is no breaking up. So it's like it just spills out of him, this smooth line. Who'd stoop to blame this sort of trifling? Even had you skill in speech, again he breaks up, which I have not, to make your will quite clear to such an one and say blah 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 blah. This guy is going insane, and he's trying to keep it in, but he doesn't have skill in speech, like he said, so he's not doing very well, and we know what's happened. And he even says, we can talk about this idea of respect. I choose never to stoop. He said, I could explain the situation to her and say, well, I don't like this about you, or I don't, agree with your behaviour on this, but that would be stooping. And I never stoop. So stoop, I don't make myself lower. If I don't like something, someone has to be a mind reader, someone has to accommodate me. I shouldn't have to make my will known. I shouldn't have to say this. I will not lower myself or put myself in a position that makes me look bad. It's fine when he says to the emissary, yeah, sit down, stand up, do this, do that, but he will not. So what does he do? He's faced with this impossible task. I can't explain myself to the woman I supposedly love. So what happens? Oh, sir, she smiled no doubt whenever I passed her, but who passed without much the same smile? He's like, yeah, she smiled at me, but she smiled at freaking everybody. So what am I supposed to do? I can't say, yo, why are you smiling at that person? Why are you smiling at that person? Oh no, that would put me in such a disrespected position. So we get to the mother of all pauses in this whole dramatic monologue. He goes, this grew. And a pause. What grew? Like there's so much pregnant meaning in this, just these two words. What grew? His rage? The fact that she was doing it more? His jealousy? Or his plans? They have a little pause. Again, he's still trying to be quite deliberate with what he says. And then he says, I gave commands. Another pause, another caesura. He stops. Browning really wants us to consider the implication of these words. This grew. I gave commands. He doesn't need to say much more than this. There's so much meaning here. What commands did you give? And then he says, then all smiles stopped together. But he doesn't say, I had her killed. Doesn't say that. Doesn't need to. He just says, the smiles stopped. He's a psychopath, this guy. He's an absolute monster. Why did the smiles stop? It's like, and there she stands, looking as if she were alive. And he echoes the beginning of the poem. Right at the beginning, we had suspicion something's not quite right. And now, again, he doesn't need to come out and say it exactly, but now we know. She dead. And then, that's it. He just goes, yeah, okay, stand up now. We're going to go meet the rest of the crew downstairs. We're going to talk about this new lady that's going to be my wife. And, oh, by the way, on the way out, look at that. That's a Neptune there, taming a seahorse. I'm guessing this is a statue because it's cast in bronze. So this whole idea of taming ends right on the idea of taming. And what do you do when you tame something? It means you control it. This Duke is a control freak. Klaus of Innsbruck cast it in bronze for me. So I gave commands and he tamed this mythological scene and put it there for me, just like I tamed my last Duchess. Robert Browning was actually asked about the meaning of the poem. He said, someone asked, was the Duchess killed? And he said, yeah, that's exactly what it means. She was killed or put in a convent. So like a convent, like a nunnery. So she was made into a nun. She was locked up somewhere far away. But to be honest, that's up to you as the reader to decide. The poet himself has said, well, there you go. You've got two options. There's not really an alternative option because that's how the poet wrote it. But honestly, for me, all the way through the poem, it feels as though she's been murdered. I don't see personally many implications that she's been put in a nunnery. Do you see any? Or do you believe that she was killed? Do you see evidence and implications that would suggest that she was killed? What do you think? Anyway, let me know in the comments below. I've just went through once a quick analysis of things that sprung out to me that seemed like the most impactful things, the things that I would emphasize if I was writing an exam. Surely you could read this poem 10, 20 times and you'll come up with way more stuff. Was there anything that I missed, anything that I left out? I didn't address every line, so maybe there's a comment that you think, is quite insightful. Please put it down below and I'll get back to you, or I'll respond, I'll tell you my thoughts. It might help other people. Other people might discuss and springboard off your ideas. And of course, you'd do me a huge favor if you could hit the like button and subscribe. This is a very new channel, and if people want more videos, hitting the like button and subscribing will tell me that, and then I'll end up making more. At the moment, I've got this idea of making deep analyses of all the main poems covered in GCSE English, The Power and Conflict. But I'm going to do more. I'm going to do A-level, and I'm going to do common university poems and novels and plays and stuff like that. So let me know you liked it. Thank you for watching. Let me know what you think of the poem. That was My Last Duchess by Robert Browning. Have a great day.